Hello, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk about Han Kang's The Vegetarian. Han Kang is an author who has brought the depth of Korean literature to the world, and she further proved her value by winning the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Vegetarian is a story that begins with a woman suddenly refusing to eat meat. However, it's not just a simple behavioral change, but rather a symbolic story of oppression and liberation, and of the loss and recovery of self. Now we will follow the journey of the character Yeong-hye. Where did her transformation begin? How did the internal conflict and societal oppression she faced isolate her? And what path did she ultimately choose? Let's explore. One day she said she would no longer eat meat. She didn't give a reason. Her husband casually brushed it off, as if it were nothing, just a trivial whim. He prepared the meal, as he always did, and sat down to a meatless table without any fuss. But that day's meal was different from before. The small void he felt, that subtle sense of something missing, was like the first crack to appear between them. At the table, without the meat, the husband could not easily accept the change. For a while, he thought it would pass. He was sure that after some time, she would start eating meat again. But she didn't. The meat never returned to the table, and even their conversations no longer felt the same. Although he was aware of the change, he tried to ignore it. And in the silence, she continued to change little by little. Yeong-hye no longer hesitated when it came to meat. Her hands chose something else instead, and her body began to grow thinner. It was evident even to her husband that she was wasting away, but he didn't say a word about the change. This was not just a simple refusal. It was as if she was rejecting everything that surrounded her, not just meat. She was drifting further away from the world. Her husband didn't try to understand her transformation for some time. No, he couldn't understand. He simply believed that everything would return to normal if he waited long enough. He was sure she would start eating meat again and go back to being the way she was. But her body grew thinner, and her gaze seemed to grow more distant. He couldn't accept it, but she didn't come back. Her change was not temporary. It was a transformation that had begun deep within her. She no longer lived within the expectations of her husband. She was distancing herself from the image of the ordinary wife that he had wanted her to be. Her gaze no longer met his, and her body became increasingly transparent. The dream that night, Yeong-hye had a dream. It was a dream filled with blood. The ground was covered in blood, and piled high were countless pieces of meat. In her dream, she wandered among them. The smell of blood was overwhelming, and the meat surrounded her. The dream was so vivid that even after waking up, she couldn't shake off the sensation. It wasn't just a dream. It was something that stirred deep within her. She couldn't escape from it. The smell of blood, the unpleasant feeling the meat gave her in the dream. She could no longer eat meat. Whenever meat was placed in front of her, she recalled the scene from the dream, and in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to eat. She wanted to run away from the horrible scene she had witnessed in her dream. But the dream had changed her reality. It wasn't just a nightmare. It had awakened something buried deep within her. She couldn't return to her previous life. That dream had shaken both her body and her mind. From that moment on, she began to reject meat. No, it wasn't just meat. She was rejecting her entire life. The beginning of isolation. Her transformation wasn't limited to just herself. It deeply affected those around her. Her husband wanted her to come back, but she was already gone. She no longer lived within the expectations of her husband. She was no longer the ordinary wife he had known. He didn't know why she had changed so much, and he couldn't accept her transformation. He tried to bring her back. He wanted her to eat meat again and return to their previous life. But she didn't come back. She was no longer the person he knew. Her change had turned his life upside down. He wanted her to return to normal, but she had already distanced herself far beyond his reach. Her transformation also shocked her family. Her parents couldn't accept the change in their daughter. Her father, in particular, strongly opposed it. He wanted her to return to how she had been. He wanted his daughter to live a normal life again. He was determined to bring her back, even by force. But she could no longer live within their expectations. Her father tried to force-feed her meat, He wanted her to be normal again, but at that moment she completely broke down. She could no longer live within their expectations. She no longer resisted her father's violence. Her silence spoke louder than any words. She didn't say a word, but her silence said everything. Her own path. Now she no longer lived within anyone's expectations. She was trying to sever her connection to the world. Her body grew weaker, and she became more isolated from society. She no longer lived according to anyone's expectations. She was cutting herself off from the world through her own body. Her body wasted away, but she was trying to protect herself within her isolation. Though her body grew frail, there was a firm resolve inside her. She no longer lived within the world's expectations. She was isolated by her own choice, and even in that isolation, she didn't lose herself. In fact, in that isolation, she began to rediscover herself. This novel tells the story of a woman trying to find liberation within the oppression that surrounds her. Yeong-hye separates herself from the world through her body and finds her own path within it. But the path is not easy, and in that isolation, she ultimately destroys herself. Her choice raises many questions for us. Are we truly free? Do we live genuinely free lives within the social expectations that surround us? Or, like Yeong-hye, are we living oppressed? Yeong-hye's story asks us this question, and the answer is something each reader must find for themselves. How did you read this novel? What did Yeong-hye's choice mean to you? If you found this story interesting, please subscribe and like, and join us for more stories in the future. Thank you.